Hi guys, I hope you're all doing great. I've been asked by Kushal to do this module on neurointerfacing with flexible electronics in order to give you insight to some aspects of those methods. Yeah, I'm very sorry, I'm not a native English speaker, so please excuse any mistakes. Yeah, so the last modules of Neurotech Davis basically covered EEG and its corresponding signal processing. But today we will deal with other interfacing methods using the direct interplay of the brain and electronics. Thus, we will have a look at some engineering aspects and close the module with an example for such applications. To start with a recap on EEG, you will know that EEG is a non-invasive method where we have on-scalp electrodes of different numbers, and the electrodes are widely distributed over the whole head in order to cover every brain region. Thus, we measure postsynaptic potentials of neuron clusters, usually millions of neurons, but we only get low amplitudes, like in the lower range of microvolt. This is also why this method is very susceptible to any errors coming from like other electronic devices in the laboratory. But on the other hand, of course, EEG is extremely easy to use. But for BMI applications, we are interested in higher resolutions and accuracy. And another important point is that we want to provide a quite high bandwidth, which is not always given in general by EEG. Such issues can then be solved by invasive methods, which enable the direct interplay between the brain and electronics. Of course, we also get stronger signals as there is no skull in between, and we have the possibility of higher resolutions. And further, quite important point is that invasive methods enable the bidirectional interaction, therefore providing the possibility of recording as well as stimulating neurons. This again allows the performance of so-called closed-loop systems, which we will have a look at now. In a general manner, one can say that the neural activity provides the source of our information, and we need electrodes to record those informations and then sufficient algorithms in order to extract our desired information. Those information is then decoded in order to be transformed and processed, for instance, by a motor of an artificial arm. So, of course, we can get feedback what the arm is doing by watching it, so our visual feedback. But it would be great to provide, some way like an artificial feeling for the arm. This would be possible, for instance, by touching sensors or heat sensors at the hand. And what we then need is an encoding process. So we encode the signals from the touch sensors, for instance, and input those signals again to the brain, to the neurons, and thus we can provide something like a artificial feeling. Apart from this, there are also applications for closed-loop systems like drug delivery by microfluidic devices, whereas the drug release can then be triggered by also electrical signals recorded by electrodes. So let's have a look at brain-computer interfaces. When we want to connect the brain to electronics, we might first consider the macroscopic material properties. So on the one hand, we have the brain, which matter, of course, is quite soft and biological. It also moves and performs some pulsation in living systems. And additionally, it is sensitive to external influences. On the other hand, we have the computer or its electronics, which usually consists of hard metals like silicon, gold, and so on. And these metals are quite stiff and inflexible, of course. Going to the microscopic level, we can say that the basis of the brain are the neurons. And those neurons communicate, as you know, by action potentials. Whereas electronic systems communicate by current and voltage. So, of course, action potentials are also, in a way, current and voltage, but the important difference is that the action potentials are based on ions, so charged atoms that are missing an electron or having an electron, like too much. But in electronics, current and voltage are given by electrons themselves. So there is a very important difference how the brain and how electronics work. And in general, I think one can say that the major challenge of invasive neural interfaces is to connect those properties and make them interplay in a specific way. But maybe the most difficult obstacle to solve is to couple those ionic and electronic signals. And this problem is not really trivial. Yeah. So how can we in general interact with neurons? There are different ways known to interact with neurons, for instance, by thermal methods, which are based on induced changes in the cell membrane capacitance, or also the conductance of receptor ion channels. And the temperature, which is usually used, varies between 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. But as you might imagine, this method has to be controlled extremely precisely, as too high temperatures have the potential of cell damage. And also one have to ensure a very close proximity of the temperature inducing electrode and the desired neuron. Further method called the optogenetics is based on light and on photosensitive ion channels and voltage-sensitive dyes. The light can then, for instance, be introduced by microscale inorganic light-emitting diodes. And this method provides very high temporal resolution. Maybe the oldest way of neuromodulation is by drugs, but you will know that many drugs have quite heavy side effects of target effects, which is why people are trying to solve this issue with microfluidic systems and devices, where we can provide a targeted drug delivery directly in the brain, and for instance, triggered by action potentials that are recorded by electrodes, drug can be released at the perfect point. But one challenge of this method is that there are some issues to ensure the safe drug storage, as well as to refill those storage when depleted. But the method we will concentrate on today is the one of electrical modulation. Actually, the way of electrical neural interaction is known quite long. One might say that the first experiment is maybe the one of Galvani. I think it was in the 18th century, where he made a detached frog leg twitch by applying a small voltage. And similar methods are already widely used in clinical treatments, for instance, in DBS, deep brain stimulation, which is used to treat Parkinson. What is done for neural interfacing is that microelectrodes can detect action potentials and proximity of about 50 to 100 micrometer on the one hand. And on the other hand, one can induce action potentials by applying small voltage. The temporal resolution is basically defined by the refractory time of neurons. So just to remind you, I've pasted here again the structure of an action potential in general. So the refractory period is this part of the action potential. So when it's triggered, all sodium channels close at the top, and they remain closed until this minimum. And at this point, they slowly start to opening again until the resting state of minus 70 microvolt is reached again. All right. So the spatial resolution of this method is, by the way, only limited basically by the electrode side, which usually ranges between tenths of micro to several millimeters. When comparing with the average diameter of neurons, one can say that it should be in general possible to obtain single neuron resolution. So far, these interaction methods have been employed in different architectures, and we will cover two of them today. The first architecture is the one of a sheet type architecture, which can be placed on the cortex surface, and it has the advantage that it's able to cover quite large areas and does not result in any major movement restriction of the brain. And it also doesn't penetrate it, which is why it's only moderately invasive. It is, when it's flexible, it is conformable and can fit to the uneven surface of the cortex. And as shown here, it can also be folded sometimes and then be placed in sulci, like the cleft between the left and right hemisphere of the brain, which is sometimes hard to address otherwise, and of special interest, I think, for epilepsy. And I think in this paper they did it with silicon nanomembrane electrodes. Devices that are currently in clinical studies employed often have electrode diameters in the region, in the region of some millimeter with a bit larger spacings. But studies have shown that to address like very advanced treatments like word decoding and similar, we should provide sub-millimeter region. So one goal of this method is, or one potential of this method is to cover large areas while also providing a high density. The second method is, or the second architecture is the one of penetrating needles, which obviously allow us to access deeper lying neurons, but those devices usually only cover very small areas. One famous representative of this architecture is the so-called Utah array. As you see here, it has 10 times 10, so 100 silicon needles, and the length is around about 1.5 millimeter. And as this device is inserted directly in the brain tissue, it has, of course, the potential for damage of the tissue. And apart from this, an important aspect is that micromotions, so for instance, the pulsation of the brain around those stiff silicon needles, can induce inflammatory reactions and strain on the brain tissue. This again can then impair the device longevity. For addressing this problem, one has to consider the employed electrode materials. We have previously already seen that metal electrodes result in a certain mismatch of properties. So in a more detailed view, we can say that metal electrodes have a high Young's modulus. This basically describes the stiffness of the material. So as you see, the order of magnitude is quite different between the one of the brain and old-fashioned metal electrodes. And in addition to this, we have a high impedance. It's a certain form of resistance, which is quite high for metal electrodes. And this again results in thermal noise, also called Johnson noise sometimes. And thus we have quite a poor SNR. For stimulation, it is also quite important to consider so-called charge injection capacity. It basically describes the maximal charge delivery per unit area. And as it's per unit area, it also impacts to what degree we can reduce our electrode size, and thus how our spatial resolution is limited. And of course, in general, we are aware of the ineffective coupling, which is the result of coupling between ions and electrons. So what are the results for neural tissues? As we said earlier, the electrodes or old-fashioned electrodes are inflexible during pulsation and motion, and thus we have quite a high strain during the insertion process. Apart from this, due to the different materials inserted to the body, so the metal, foreign body reactions of the immune system might reject the device, or any kind of inflammations may occur, and this will eventually result in scar tissues, which then insulate our electrodes in a way, or increase the distance between electrode and neuron, and thus our device functionality is either decreased or even ruined. One possible solution for this problem is the employment of flexible electronics. The idea is that we provide adjusted properties to the brain tissue, while our materials are usually based on organic materials. So organic means based on carbon. And as you might know, this then has, in a way, chemical similarity to biomolecules. Actually, this technology is definitely not new. It's already widely employed in OPVs, so organic photovoltaic. solar cells, or light-emitting diodes and any kind of transistor systems. And one advantage of organic materials is that they are extremely variable. So they are tunable, and there are very different materials present that we could use. So for instance, we have insulating materials and also conducting materials. And in the context of neurointerfaces, some materials are especially of interest because they are considered as biocompatible, and we can choose between insulating materials for, let's say, the substrate and conducting materials for PDOT PSS. And actually PDOT PSS, it's such interesting for neurointerface that I would like to discuss it a bit in the new few slides. What is PDOT? PDOT can be considered as a rising star in the bioelectronic business, and it belongs to the general class of conjugated polymers. What this means is that we have alternating single and double bonds in the polymer, as you can see here. For those of you who are not familiar with this kind of notation, the part within the brackets, it's like the single repeating unit, and you can imagine to be placed to the left and to the right like a few dozen times. I think in PDOT, those change consist of maybe in the average 15 to 20 times, but it's different for any polymer. And the single repeating unit is just the important part. So we have single and double bonds, which are alternating. Sometimes you might also read they are called pi and sigma bonds, but that's not important for this aspect right now. But the thing is that in those pi bonds, electrons can travel. So they are so-called delocalized over the whole polymer backbone, and can travel through the chain in a way. In general, PDOT has quite high stability and it's optical transparent, and it also provides quite a high connectivity for this class of materials. In addition to this, it's quite useful to know that its properties can also be adjusted with varying process parameters. So, for instance, there are different polymerization methods available. PDOT is a p-type conductor, which means that it is conducting positive charge carrier or electron holes. So, a part of the pi backbone where there is an electron missing. And this again means that we need to provide a counter ion that receives one electron and thus compensates in a way the positive charge on PDOT. This compensating ion is often also called dopant, and it's often chosen to be PSS, so polystyrene sulfonate. It's induced during the polymerization, usually. In this process, PDOT is oxidized, meaning it gives away one of its electrons, and PDOT is oxidized and PSS is reduced. It receives the electron. And when we apply voltage to the material, the positive charge can then travel along the PDOT backbone. So what you guys might just now keep in mind is that when you read about PDOT PSS, is that it's an organic material, so chemical similarity is provided to the biotissue, and that PDOT PSS is a combination of positively charged PDOT and negatively charged PSS, and both of them are polymers. For neurointerfaces in general, these properties are interesting because, as previously mentioned, it's soft, flexible, has high connectivity, and so on. But in addition to this, it is usually considered also as biocompatible, and it has a so-called bulk surface, which is contrast to metals, which have a quite even surface. And this bulk surface results, of course, from this chain nature of polymers lying just on top of each other. And this bulk surface means that electrodes which are covered with PDOT PSS, for instance, have a notably higher surface area than pure metal electrodes. And thus, we have a higher charge injection capacity, as you might remember, because it's per unit area than we have it with pure metals. And In addition to this, this bulk surface allows that like ions from the electrolyte, like sodium, potassium, and so on, can penetrate to the material. And PDOT PSS has therefore something like a mixed connectivity of both electrons and ions. And this again results in a better coupling. So yeah, better coupling to address the obstacle of ionic and electronic mismatch. To close this module, we might have a short look at the device presented by Neuralink last year. What they published was a device with a needle type architecture, but in contrast to the Utah array, which was the one with 10 times 10 silicon needles. The device by Neuralink provide the flexible threads with which have less strain on the brain tissue, of course. They reported arrays with about 48 or 96 threads with each 32 electrodes, which resulted in around about 3,000 channels. And as you can see, the electrode dimension we have discussed previously are also applying to this device here. The length of the threads is, by the way, a bit longer than the needles of the Utah array, which had 1.5 millimeter. 1.5. Similar to the points discussed previously, the published device also used polyamide as an insulating substrate, and the contacts are given by gold traces with electrodes covered with either iridium oxide or PDOT PSS in order to provide the properties previously mentioned, so higher CIC, charge injection capacity, and a reduced impedance. One point that should also be underlined is that there is obviously a certain difficulty when you try to insert a thread that is moving and flexible. So what the Neuralink team did was to develop a robot system, which you see here, with a shuttle that held the thread during the insertion, but which was then removed after it was placed in the brain successfully. So I think that the Neuralink device shows a quite interesting example of the combination of flexible electronics with this penetrating needle type architecture, which would definitely not be possible with old-fashioned metal electronics. And due to this, one might expect the device to be better accepted by the brain and the device to be functional over a longer time period. So as a summary, we discussed the coupling of biological and electronical systems, as well as the different interaction methods and architectures that are available, where maybe the most important difference is whether we have a penetrating or a non-penetrating architecture. We discussed the material properties as a very crucial factor, and showed that some flexible organic materials, especially PDOT PSS, may be a very promising alternative to overcome some resulting obstacles of the material mismatch. And we closed the module with Neuralink as the corresponding example. So thank you guys for your attention, and I hope I could give you a few new insights and some aspects of invasive neurointerfaces. And take care.